Hi there, it's Sid, that's Sid, and Sean, that's Sean, and we're here again. We're not talking about Bob Dylan this time, we're talking about whatever takes our fancy. This week's taking our fancy is King Crimson, a very key album in the history of rock and the history of progressive rock, and indeed the history of King Crimson. This is the first of a series of occasional podcasts in which we'll be talking about very important things to us. The new Peter Gabriel album, a very underrated and we think brilliant David Bowie album, and other albums we think are worth of your attention, and as well as keeping up with a bit of news from the world of music, entertainment, and hopefully not politics. Sid is in his capsule, and I'm in mine. We hope you join us. And now, King Crimson. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
We're discussing this now. It's one of the most important and pivotal albums in the history of progressive rock, which has just been re-released in a splendid new form. And it's King Crimson's Larks, Tongues in Aspic, of course, and it's now available in a new 2 CD, 2 Blu-ray set. This includes a couple of things that are very interesting and new. Look at that. Look at that artwork. The wonderful tape boxes reproduced for you on the inner sleeves. Well, it's got new 2023 stereo and surround mixes by Stephen Wilson, this. And we'll be talking about them. He's done surround mixes of this and stereo mixes of this album before. And it's got new elemental mixes by David Singleton, also King Crimson manager stroke producer, and 2 Blu-rays, which for the first time include the complete recording sessions and session reels from the recording of Larks, Tongues in Aspic, and also the original mixes. Look at this. Look at this. That's splendid. Is that the vinyl version?
This is the vinyl version.
I've not seen that. It's the first time I've seen that.
Containing elemental mixes.
Yes, that's two LPs.
Yeah, 2 LP version.
So we both heard this now. Both had time to cogitate and digest about this album. Sid, this is a very important album for you because I think we can just say Sid is the world's leading authority on King Crimson. He's written a book about them twice, and he's very closely enmeshed in their mystical world. And I think this album, it's fair to say, is Sid's favourite album.
Yeah.
Why is that?
I think it's quite simply it's because I had my life changed when I saw King Crimson in the November 1972, which was the first tour of this lineup with David Cross, John Wetton, Bill Bruford, Robert Fripp, and Jamie Muir, and I'd experienced nothing else like it at the time. I mean, I'd been going to concerts for a little while, and I saw bands like Free, Uriah Heep, Mountain, Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, all of those bands, many of whom are regarded as absolute musical legends today, of course, and that sort of blues rock stuff, or blues rock based stuff. I mean, it was just meat and potatoes. It was what most music fans were brought up on. And I loved it and relished it. But seeing Larks, Tongues perform, we didn't know it was Larks, Tongues being performed live at the time, but for convenience sake, seeing that album performed live before it was recorded was just astonishing. I'd honestly heard nothing like it. I mean, I'd heard King Crimson before.
Yeah. Is it fair to say you expected a very different evening when you walked in the room?
Yeah.
Had you seen King Crimson before?
No, I hadn't. I'd missed them in 1971.
You missed them the previous time. So you'd heard the previous records then?
Yeah. I was a fan of all of them. I'd heard them out of sequence.
Yes.
But I was a fan of all of them. And of course, you got to remember the album that was out just a few months before the Larks Tongues concert tour was Earthbound,
live album,
a live album, which of course was very different.
And with a completely only linking factor is Robert Fripp, because the rest
Yeah,
of the band was, of course,
yeah,
completely different, wasn't it? This was a
yeah,
whole new lineup apart from the central figure, Robert Fripp.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so, what were you expecting when you turned up at Newcastle City Hall then?
There was honestly a conversation. I can vividly recall it with a pal, and we were wondering if they might do a number off Earthbound. Like, oh, I wonder if they'll do Peoria off Earthbound because we really like that one. It's like,
Improvisation, Sid.
so it's fair to say that there was nothing that night that sounded like Peoria or anything.
Yeah, and so was the, sorry to ask these questions,
Oh,
was the
no.
repertoire that night wholly new, or were there any elements from their previous career in the set?
The set began with what we now know to be Larks Tongues Part 1, and
Yes.
the only kind of concession to to the previous repertoire was the encore, which was 21st Century Schizoid Man. But that was, and I guess that was a kind of a reward, as it were.
Yeah,
To the
you
audience.
sat
Oh,
through all
here's
this.
something we know.
Here's something you know the words to.
Yeah, yeah,
So that is apart from the encore, then that's an entire night of new stuff.
yeah,
That's quite a lot to ask, isn't it? Particularly when this is quite challenging, isn't it, compared to Islands? I
yeah.
mean, that's their
I,
previous studio album.
I,
And
I think it's fair to say that bands back at that point, weren't too worried about going out and performing
new stuff.
new stuff. I saw Yes the next year, or was it the year after? I can't remember. And they were doing Tales from Topographic Oceans, which at that point wasn't in the shops in Newcastle.
Oh, it hadn't come out. All right. Well, they
So
played all of it, did they?
yeah, they played it all.
Double album.
And I'm pretty sure I can't remember if Lamb Lies Down. I saw Genesis a couple of years later, and they were doing Lamb Lies Down, and I'm not sure if that had even been released at the point at which we saw them. But anyway, the point of the story is Larks, Tongues and Aspic hadn't been released in December 1972. It wasn't until March that it was released, March the 23rd, and it was just astonishing music. And what stayed with me was after it had all finished. Usually when you walked home from a gig, your ears were ringing a little bit because it was loud,
Yeah. Yeah.
and you've got a bit of sweat on, and you're with your pals, and you say, "Oh, do you remember that bit where da, da, da." There was an added focus with King Crimson that night because Jamie Muir was such an incandescent presence on stage.
This is the percussionist Jamie Muir.
There was no I'd not really see. I mean, I saw bands with frontmen, like Robert Plant or Peter Gabriel, even, and he dressed up a bit then. But for Jamie Muir, who was clearly not the front man, he wasn't the lead singer, but he was this kind of energetic presence on stage. That's my memory, which is probably wrong, is that he seemed to be constantly moving to and fro around the stage. I mean, in reality, he was probably hemmed in just behind his percussion kit. But so
he obviously was larger than life, though.
Yeah, that's the point. And it was features. It was small things like the tinkling bells, and big things like the thrashing chains against. He had this huge metal plate, and he was, banging the chains against that for great dramatic effect. And the other thing was that there was this piece of music which Fripp introduced as vista of an operating theatre under electric arc light, or near as damn it, something along those lines. And to us, we thought, all right, this is a new number, and when Larks, Tongues and Aspic came out on vinyl, I was disappointed that number wasn't on the album. And I thought, well, maybe it had been retitled
Yeah, yeah,
and listening to the album, it hadn't been retitled because it just wasn't there. It didn't sound like what I remembered from the gig. And the final thing to mention about all of this is so I saw them in the November. The album didn't come out till the March. But somehow I was fixated on keeping the fragments of this music that I remembered alive in my head, and getting it home. The final thing to mention about getting it home was that day. I got a bus up to Newcastle, and I had a job, like an evening job, and I had some money in. I couldn't really afford to buy many albums when I was a kid, but I had some money. I'd been paid, and I bought 2 LPs that day. Now that is so rare, for me to buy 2 LPs in a day. I'd be lucky if I get one a month. And the 2 LPs I bought next to each other was Larks, Tongues and Aspic by King Crimson, and also released on that day, For Your Pleasure by Roxy Music.
Really?
And
both on EG artists.
Both released on the same day, and getting the bus home, I couldn't wait to get home to play either of these things. The downside was that my dad worked in a factory, and he was on night shift. So I couldn't play the albums, because when he was working night shifts, fair enough. So the house had to be pretty much silent when he was in bed asleep, and we had a radiogram thing in the living room, and I put Larks Tongues on, and it's such a quiet introduction. I couldn't hear anything for Jacko Jackchick, funnily enough, had a similar-ish experience when he bought the album, presumably at the same time, where he was lying with his head in between 2 speakers, listening to this very quiet.
Turn this up.
And he turns it up. But so that's my Larks, Tongues and Aspic experience. 50 years later, who could have guessed? The teenager me at that time could not have guessed that 50 years later I'd be writing sleeve notes for this marvelous edition. This for me, Sean,
bit of a conflict of interest.
This for me, Sean, is kind of pretty much everything a King Crimson fan could ever wish for.
Well, for you, this is the dream come true, isn't it? Which I'm going to tell the listeners something you once told me, and this is years ago. You said you wouldn't rest until every note ever played by this lineup was available in record shops and online retail sites for people to buy. And I think we're pretty much there, aren't we, with the previous box set, which we might mention in a minute, and which includes a wide range of live gigs, and they're also on the DGM website, the King Crimson website. There are loads more, and there's been the Newcastle gig you were at has been released as a internet only release, hasn't it, as well? And
CD release.
Yeah, and that must be astonishing for you, because you wrote the sleeve note as well. But that is the gig that you, as you said today, has changed your life.
Yeah.
And now we have the complete recording sessions available on here on Blu-ray. There's the band. There's the band in the studio. They are looking very, very businesslike. They're looking very serious. And this is serious business, making this record.
This begs the question, because I remember when the complete King Crimson box was being compiled.
Upside down, you're holding that upside
down.
Oh,
right. The King Crimson box was being compiled a few years ago. There was some discussion around, I wouldn't say it was controversial, but there was some discussion about releasing what was then a kind of a session reel, which would later be called Keep That One Nick.
Yeah, that's on here, isn't it?
Yeah,
that's what's on there. A lot of material on there. So future. This was quite early on in the series of King Crimson box sets. This is in the what was then the 40th anniversary series, and this is called the Complete Recordings, which is a bit unusual. Where we see we've now got the complete sessions in this one, and there's that thing you just mentioned, that big track, which is called
Keep That One, Nick.
Keep That One, Nick. Is that like half an hour long, or is it an hour long?
It's about an hour long.
An hour long,
and
that is a compilation of highlights from the complete sessions, isn't it?
The controversy then was, I think either David Singleton or perhaps Stephen Wilson said, and I'm paraphrasing, so apologies to both of them, is who would want to listen to this? And my response was, I would want to listen to this. Yeah, but apart from Sid, who would want to listen to this? And actually, it turns out that Keep That One, Nick, at the time was a fascinating insight. It was literally like an audio documentary, albeit a curated one, curated by a brilliant piece of editing by David Singleton, one of the many brilliant pieces of editing he does. And it brought that album, it sits alongside the recorded album. And of course, the finished album is the definitive article. But what this supporting material allows you to do is it allows you to get into the it's like a ringside seat into the creative process. And I think the complete session reels is that on steroids.
Yes.
What you realize when you're listening to the complete session reels, and I think there's like 9 hours of it or something, or possibly even more, I haven't made a note of it, is you hear the band constantly making adjustments. You realize that the material isn't written down to the nth degree. It shows you, Robert Fripp doesn't get out a chart or tell people what to play. They play it, and from take to take, it differs. And John Wetton is working towards a part that kind of has muscle and bite, and he doesn't quite get there on that take, but somebody, it's this constant foregrounding and shifting of ideas, literally ideas on the fly that weren't there in the previous take. Now, there are some people who would say, well, who needs all this? And you're never going to play it more than once. Okay, so I admit I've got quite a bit of skin in the game, and I'm a bit of a nut about this album. I've listened to the complete session reels a couple of times minimum. I mean, I think it's probably a fair few more than that. Do you think that's these kind of complete sessions? Do you think they're overkill?
I think to some people they will be, but I don't think that's a reason not to release them. I know that when there's a previous book, I mean, pardon me if I'm a spoiler alert, but isn't the plan to release a similar complete sessions from the King Crimson catalogue throughout? Is that the plan?
Yeah.
Because they've done it already on the first album, haven't they, with the 1969 box set?
Yeah.
And I remember Stephen Wilson in an interview saying, who wants to listen to all that? But you do, and there are some people who do. There are musicians and Uber fans want to, and I think it's not for everyone, but I think more bands should do it with notable albums if there's enough material still available in their archives, because I think this is a very, very important record, and the more we get about it released, it is a victory. With many albums, I would say it wasn't worth doing it because of the reason you just said. And that's the way this material is constructed. You've got one person usually, whoever that is, coming in with a riff or an idea and presenting it to the group, and then it's up to them to interpret that idea. And how they go, when they go through the takes, it evolves into the form we recognize. And I think because there's so much flexibility and variation in the different approaches and takes, that makes it a valuable musical experience in itself. And with many bands, that wouldn't be the case, because in some cases, they've been playing the stuff live. They know what the parts are, and they're just trying to get a clean version down. That isn't King Crimson, particularly in this lineup. They're not trying to get the version we've been trying to play every night, because they've been playing it often quite differently every night. And indeed, you mentioned early on a operating room under arc lights, a vista of that. You were disappointed that wasn't on the record. Well, that's an improvisation, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
And this was the thing about this band. Their improvisatory zeal is unusual in rock music. If you got jazz or some other form of music, it's commonplace. But in rock music, to have the nerve to leap off the cliff night after night and play improvisations that people like yourself in the audience think are tunes they've written, and end up disappointed they're not on the next LP. That's a different thing. And you mentioned the Genesis and the Yes playing huge chunks of new music quite bravely to audiences. I mean, it's a big ask for the audience that wouldn't be done by many people today.
No.
But they weren't improvising huge chunks of it, were they? That was all written through composed material. There's a little 5 minutes in Lamb Lies Down where they do, but even that was on a very strict leash, wasn't it? They weren't going to go off for 20 minutes, were they? It was very carefully timed, because you've got this slideshow behind it, and you've got to fit in with that.
I think you touch on an important point there, because in 1972, you know, there just weren't many rock bands. There were lots of jazz groups doing it, but there weren't many rock bands doing it. I can only think of 2 other bands that I saw that year that were vaguely in that universe, but kind of different. And that was Matching Mole supporting John Mayall's Blue Breakers, and the other band that was kind of it vaguely in that world was Can. And they were kind of coming on stage without much of a plan. But what you get with Can would be this kind of fairly insistent pulse within the music. So it'd be more akin to vamping on a kind of a riff than just everything wide open. With Crimson's, I'm not saying Crimson are better than Can, I'm just saying it was a completely different approach. And it was very, very dynamic. And I think that's something else the album controversially does and doesn't capture. Larks Tongues is a very dynamic album. I mean, you know, literally from very quiet to very loud at one level. That's one level of the dynamics. But there's something else going on within the album that they managed to capture the spirit of. I know from talking to various members of that band, well, talk to all of the members of that band, but there was a sort of sense that the album was slightly disappointing for them because it didn't quite capture. I remember Bill Bruford being very underwhelmed by you know, something like the Talking Drum, which was meant to build into this enormous raging thing, and it didn't quite get there in the studio. And I think I can understand why he might think that, but on the other hand, there's plenty of fire in there, and when you get into alternative takes, and when you get into something we haven't mentioned in detail, the elemental mixes that David Singleton's done, which have a far spikier, jagged edge to them, a rawer, a kind of a raw edge to it, then I think you probably do get something close to what Bill thought it should have sounded like in his head.
And of course, that's the thing. You saw this group live before you'd heard the record. You know, you heard this material live, but the vast majority of people who've bought the record since didn't see the band live. So for them, you know, I can understand you being, you say, your life-changing gig, your world being tilted on its axis by the show. and then the album sounding slightly subdued in comparison. But that's not the case for the vast majority of listeners. I never saw this band live. I was barely born when this band toured, Sid, as you know. There's a big age gap between us, obviously. I'm always the youngest person on any podcast, I find. I experienced this music listening to this on an old vinyl LP back in the day, back in the late 70s, probably.
Yeah.
And I was incredibly intrigued and baffled and fascinated by it. And to me, it was I'd heard the first album by King Crimson. In fact, I think I got this album in one of those two-for packages, where there was this album in the second slot, and the first slot was in the court.
Yeah.
So I'd heard somebody had lent me in the court at school. I thought, bloody hell, this is good, you know. And then I saw in the shop, oh, it's two for the price of one now. And I just couldn't resist it. And I'd never heard Larks, Tongue and Aspic. And it's obviously a different sound world to the first album. You know, the lush melody and the lush, colourful mellotron and all that is this is the start of the colder King Crimson, isn't it? This is like metallic. The rhythm section on a song like Easy Money, it's almost like really up in the speakers, the bass and the drums. And then you've got Jamie Muir with all these metallic scraping noises. That's from a different set of influences than the first album, but you can still see the thread. Like there's beautiful melodies on this album. I think Exiles is an achingly gorgeous tune. And I think it also has a new thing for King Crimson, where their previous ballads had been very English and very lush and very courtly. A lot of their like Lady of the Dancing Water and things like that. Book of Saturday is like a different, more grown up, more sophisticated kind of music in comparison, isn't it? It's like and John Wetton's voice fits that perfectly, and the words are very good as well.
I think
the words are very intriguing words, and he's trying to do the kind of thing that Dylan was doing on Tangled Up in Blue, where he's disassociating lines from each other, but there's still something going on you're trying to decode between the two people. And I think that's one of the most fascinating sets of lyrics on any King Crimson record. And I think also the tune is just lovely. And I think they play it just beautifully. And I think you hear several goes at it, don't you? With obviously Fripp off mic, trying to put John Wetton off and trying to crack him up while he's trying to do his very serious vocal, which and that's one of the many insights into the band these complete sessions provide. The humour. There's a lot of humour in King Crimson, which people are often surprised by. I don't know why, because it's obvious. I mean, a lot of what is the terribly evil and scheming persona of Robert Fripp is actually dryly humorous in its intent. And the famous thing with Jamie Muir and Jamie Muir's very plummy voice. You remember this madman in a fur coat spitting blood, literally, and bashing chains against sheets of metal. But you hear his very quiet voice on this, and it's charming. It's just charming to hear them talking to each other. And have you got that? Did you get that one? And then you hear this ferocious noise of these very quiet people, which is basically most of the band. I mean, I don't know if you hear David Cross's voice at all. I mean, talking about quiet people. You hear Fripp's voice, obviously, and you hear John Wetton, you hear Bill, and you hear Jamie quite frequently. And I find that sort of stuff interesting. I find it the glimpse of the humans behind the enormous, monumental sound of this band. I think the influence of this band, this album, carries through for the rest of their career, because Larks, Tongues in Aspic 1 and 2 bookend this album, and then years later, 11 years later, we get Pair the Perfect Pair. That's got Larks, Tongue in Aspic Part 3, which is a set of variations. Then in the year 2000, we're hearing Larks, Tongues in Aspic Part 4. And then in the year 2003, we have Level 5, which has now been redubbed Larks, Tongues and Aspic Part 5 by Fripp. So that takes us right through to the end of King Crimson's recording career. Seeds planted here, and also in between that, things like Fracture, possibly Red, are all part of the Larks Tongues family, as Robert Fripp calls it.
Yeah.
I think the first album by King Crimson will always be one of the most influential and important albums in this kind of style of music. It was one of them that helped start it. Pre-ELP, pre-Genesis, pre-Yes, any of that stuff. They did it first. But I think in the history of King Crimson, this is the more influential album on them. I think this is where Fripp finds his compositional voice.
Yeah.
And that's very important. If you listen to this album, it's a literal different world than Islands or even Lizard or something like that.
Yeah.
I think the second album is very much in the sound world of the first album.
Yeah.
But there's a huge leap to Lizard, but that's still not Fripp finding his voice apart from an odd moments like, Prince Rupert's Lament. That's very redolent to future Fripp playing. And similarly, the Sailor's Tale, perhaps, on Islands. This album, the very bright modern percussion, the more modern singing, the harsh metallic nature of the guitar playing, and the nature of those Larks Tongues riffs, they're a blueprint for the future of King Crimson.
Definitely.
And the cross picking as well. The cross picking, which carries on right into the Discipline era. Like the next album, Fracture, you can see the basis of things that happen in the 80s there, can't you? And so I think this is a massive leap forward for Robert Fripp and King Crimson. I think this is finally a lineup that has the power and magic the first one had, but in a different kind of voice. And so I think it's, for Crimson fans, this is a key moment, and it's just a brilliant window on that world to hear the sessions.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. I think Larks Tongues crystallizes it's a beautiful time capsule. The complete sessions gives us insight into that world. I mean, for the casual fan, a remastered version or a new Stephen Wilson mix, that's enough. That'll be more than enough.
What do you think of the new mixes?
Well, as ever with you've got to kind of sometimes I want the mixes to be more radical, than they are, which is kind of why I warmed to David Singleton's Elemental mixes as much as I did. Because they it's stripped back in many respects, but it does capture that spirit of the band so well. The new mixes achieve different things, and of course if you listen to the new mixes in surround sound, that's a phenomenally good experience. It's very rich in detail and the texture of the whole thing. So those kinds of things are beautiful additions to it. For many people, all of that doesn't matter. They just want a basic experience, and that's fine.
As I say, this isn't for everyone, but for those who are interested, it's a treasure trove. Sorry?
It really is a treasure trove. That's a great description.
We've both heard Stephen Wilson's previous mixes to this. I think we sat in a recording studio to hear the first surround mix he did.
And Air Studios.
Air Lyndhurst in Hampstead, wasn't it? That's what it was. And that was a phenomenal experience because I thought they sounded amazing. And I've got used to the mixer. You get used to that. I've got surround mixes like you have of all the Crimson albums, and it was, wow. But I thought the Atmos mix on this was astonishing. I thought this was a total next level mix. I played it. I have got a new amp, ladies and gentlemen. Mainly gentlemen, I suspect. I've got a new amp, and that's like polishing the windows, And but I thought when I played this mix for the first time, I was just enraptured by the power and clarity of it, which is a next level from his previous one. The elemental mixes are valuable because to explain what David Singleton has done, he's taken different is different takes, different parts, and constructed versions of 4 of the 6 tracks with those changed instrumental contributions, hasn't he?
Yeah.
And I find that very interesting as well. I think there's some magical moments in that.
It's a version of a song that you've not heard before.
Yes, it's unusual. It's a version of a song with every single component of it different to the one you know.
Yeah,
So that it's got different bass, different drums, different guitar, but it's still the same tune. And I find that I love that kind of thing.
And for me, the elemental mixes really grab you by the lapels.
Yeah, they're brutally.
The surround sound mixes. The surround sound mixes do that as well, but in a different way.
Yeah, oh yeah, because the surround sound mix is a new presentation of what you've already heard. And of course, with all sound bits that have always been there, you didn't know were there. They're suddenly, what's happening now? But when you play the old record back, it's there, you know. But with the elemental mixes, which I would like to have heard in surround as well, to be honest. But that's the one drawback of this set. You know what I mean? It'd be great to hear them in surround. And we know David Singleton can mix in surround excellently. I suppose there's a time factor here as well. You've already got Stephen Wilson doing a surround mix. It seems a bit weird to have someone doing another one. I can understand that, but I thought the elemental mixes were such a success. I would have liked to hear them in real surround detail as well, because they are, as you say, they're physically powerful, aren't they?
I think what that observation demonstrates is basically King Crimson fans just want more.
I think what it explains is, how many mixes have we had of this album? There's not enough mixers in this set, and there's not enough mixers for me in this box.
I personally, I'm just counting the days down to the 60th anniversary
yes, I am.
edition. It can't come soon enough for me.
It's bound to be a very special presentation then. I'm sure there is.
It will be. Only I'll be using my bus pass to go up to Newcastle to buy that one.
Okay, a new mortgage.
Yeah. Well, let's leave it there then. So well,
it's been great talking about it and a great experience. I think we would definitely recommend, even if you're a long-suffering King Crimson fan, the little boxes. There's, as Sean said earlier, there's a Larks, there's a In the Court of Crimson King one, and there's now this one to join it. They fit very snugly together. I would say these are indispensable if you're a King Crimson fan. And if you're being serious about it,
if you're not a lightweight,
you need this. But I'd give it 5 stars.
Yeah,
it's the best. It's the best, even better than the big box. This is the best presentation of the album, I think. You get the original mix as well in there.
Yeah. I mean, that's important.
You get all the mixes there've been, but you also get this elemental mixes, which are fascinating, and you also get the complete sessions.
Complete sessions are just astonishing. This box, it might be small on the outside, but it's so much bigger on the inside.